The land office at Harrow's Bend smelled of wood smoke and printer's ink, and on the second Tuesday of April in 1884, it held 11 men, 1 dog, and Elias Bramwell, who came through the door with a hickory cane in his right hand and a canvas satchel over his shoulder, and asked, in a voice that did not rise or fall for the benefit of anyone listening, to file on the quarter section known locally as the shelf. Homer Riggs, who had run the land office for 6 years and had turned away 3 separate parties on that same claim, set down his pen and looked at the man in front of him for a long moment before he spoke. He was 33, dark-haired, dressed in a coat gone thin at the elbows and boots that had been resoled with care rather than money. His eyes were open and pale and fixed on nothing in particular, and the cane in his hand had a brass tip worn bright at the point from years of tapping stone. "That's rock and rattlesnake weed, mister," Riggs said. Cade Bell tried it in '79 and walked off inside a year, the Hoxie boys after him. Nothing on that shelf but scrub and a spring too far downslope to do a man's kitchen any good. "I'll take it anyway," Elias said. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Riggs looked past him at the men waiting their turn, and one of them, a broad man in a canvas duster who would later be identified around town as Silas Drummond of the Anvil Range, let out a short laugh through his nose that he did not trouble himself to hide. Riggs filled out the paper. He did not ask why. What Homer Riggs could not have known, filling in that claim in his careful clerk's hand, was that the boy who had once sat at his father's assay bench in Cinder Gulch sorting ore by weight and smell before he was old enough to shave, had grown into a man who could still read a hillside with his hands better than most men read it with their eyes, even though the fire that took his father from him had taken his sight along with it. A stranger watching him sign his name that morning, slow and careful, guided by a groove Riggs had cut into a wooden signature guide, would have seen only a poor man taking on land nobody wanted. Nobody in that room saw the rest of it. Elias had been 19 the night the assay house caught fire in Cinder Gulch, a played-out silver camp 2 ridges west of the Salmon River that had not yet learned it was played out. His father, Josiah Bramwell, had run the assay bench there for 11 years, weighing other men's hopes down to the grain, and he had taught Elias everything he knew about rock from the time the boy was old enough to hold a hammer steady. He taught him how quartz sounded different from country rock under a chisel. He taught him how galena felt heavier in the palm than its size should allow, and how certain green stains on a rock face meant copper before a man ever ran an assay to prove it, and how the smell of sulfur told you things the eye alone would miss. It was late work with the chemicals, the acids and the crucibles, and the store of blasting powder, kept dry in the back room, for a mining company that paid the assay office to hold it, that did the damage. A spilled lamp, a dry October, powder that should have been moved to the company magazine a week earlier and had not been. The building went up fast. Josiah did not come out. Elias did, but the same blast that killed his father took the sight from his eyes so completely and so suddenly that for the first 3 days afterward he kept asking why no one had thought to light a lamp. He spent the better part of 10 years afterward, learning to live inside the dark the way another man might learn a trade, which in a sense it was. He learned to count paces between a doorway and a stove. He learned to read the weather and the pitch of the wind against a roofline before it reached the ground. He worked as a rope maker in Silver City for 2 winters, and a basket weaver's apprentice in Boise, the 2 after that, and in both places he found that his hands, trained since boyhood to know rock and weight and grain, took to any close work without complaint. He never went back into a mine. He did not trust himself in the dark underground, the way he had come to trust himself in the dark of his own blindness. And there was a difference between the two that he could not have explained to a sighted man, and did not try. What he kept, the whole time, was his father's leather sample case, its little velvet-lined trays gone soft with age, and the 6 pieces of ore inside it that Josiah Bramwell had never gotten around to selling or assaying before the fire took him. Elias could not see them anymore. He could still tell everyone apart by weight and by touch, and some nights in a rented room in Boise he took them out and turned them over in his hands like a man saying a rosary, though he never told anyone that was what he was doing. He came to Harrow's Bend in the spring of 1883, with what remained of his father's small estate, $41 and the sample case, and a mule he had bought half lame and nursed sound over a winter, because a man in Boise had told him there was open land east of the settlement that nobody much wanted. He did not need much wanting it. He needed only enough that no one else would contest the claim, and land that a blind man alone could work without a hired hand he could not afford to pay. The shelf answered both conditions. It sat 200 feet above Harrow Creek, on a bench of broken rock and thin gray soil that had defeated 3 families before him. Good for nothing that Harrow's Bend understood as good. Too dry for wheat, too rocky for a plow team, without breaking a share every 3rd furrow. Its only water a spring that ran cold and faintly bitter out of a crack in the hillside a quarter-mile from where any sensible man would have built a house. He built the cabin himself over that first summer, working from a rope he had strung between the 4 corner stakes before he cut a single log, so that he always knew, hand over hand, exactly how far he had come and how far he had left to go. He strung more rope after that. Between the cabin door and the well he dug by ear and by the sound of a dropped stone, and between the well and the garden rows, and between the garden rows and the lean-to where he kept the mule, until by the 2nd month a stranger riding past on the county road could have looked up at the shelf and seen what appeared to be a small settlement laced together with clothesline, and would not have understood, unless someone told him, that every strand of it was a sentence Elias Bramwell had written to himself, so that he would never again have to ask, in the dark, which way was home. The garden he planted in rows a hand's width apart, walking them each morning with his bare feet reading the soil for weeds before his fingers ever confirmed it, and by August, he had turnips and beans and a stand of corn that would have surprised most of the sighted men in Harrow's Bend if any of them had bothered to ride up and look. Grace Linden was the first one who did. She kept her late father's post office and print shop on the town's single street, a plain unmarried woman of 27 with ink permanently under 2 of her fingernails, and she came up to the shelf in September with a letter that had been waiting 3 weeks for him at the office, because it had occurred to her, reading the return address, that a man alone on that hill, with no sight of his own, might have no way to know a letter had come at all, unless someone thought to carry it up. She found him at his rope lines, hoeing a row as straight as any man in the valley could have hoed it, with his eyes wide open, and she stood at the fence a minute before she said anything, watching the sureness of it. "You've a letter, Mr. Bramwell," she said finally. "From a Mr. Holloway, in Boise." Elias straightened and set the hoe down exactly where he could find it again. "My father's old partner," he said. "Read it to me, if you would." She did, standing at the fence while he listened with his head tilted the particular way of a man listening for something under the words, as well as in them. And when she finished, he thanked her with a formality that made her suspect, correctly, that formality was easier for him than the alternative. She came back the following week with the reply he had asked her to write down and post for him, and after that she came most weeks, not entirely for the mail. The rest of Harrow's Bend was slower to come around, and some of it did not come around by autumn at all. Thaddeus Corwin, who ran the Harrow's Bend Trust and Savings out of a brick building that was, not coincidentally, the only brick building in town, had fronted Elias the note for seed, a second-hand plow, and the mule's replacement harness back in the spring, at an interest rate that reflected Corwin's private opinion of the venture, rather than any particular malice, or so Corwin would have said if pressed. He had told Elias plainly, the day he signed the note, that he expected payment in full by the 1st of October, regardless of how the crop came in, and that the bank did not make allowances for a man's circumstances that it did not make for anyone else. "I've a dozen ranchers in this county who lost stock to the blizzard 2 winters back and never asked me for 6 months' grace on account of it," Corwin said. "I'll not begin with you." He meant it as fairness. It did not land as fairness in the room, where 2 of Corwin's own clerks exchanged a look neither of them thought Elias could catch, though he caught it in the particular silence that followed the remark. Silas Drummond made no such effort at fairness. Drummond ran 400 head on the Anvil Range that bordered the shelf to the north, and the shelf spring, thin and bitter as it was, sat close enough to his boundary line that he had wanted it for 3 years before Elias ever filed on it, purely for the extra reach it would give his stock in a dry summer. He took to riding the county road past the shelf of a Sunday with whichever of his hands would come along, and he was not quiet about what he saw. Watched a blind man try to string a fence line all summer, he told the room at the Elkhorn one August evening, to general laughter. "Better entertainment than the traveling circus, and it don't cost a dime." He said worse, in time, and more specific, the the kind of remark that does not survive repeating in full, but that made its way to Grace Linden by way of her regular post office customers, who repeated it to her the way people repeat things they know will wound, dressed up as concern. Drummond told anyone who would listen that a man who could not see the ground he plowed had no business holding a claim on it, and that the county ought to find some way to put the shelf back in the hands of someone who could use it properly, by which he meant himself. Elias heard most of it eventually, secondhand, and stripped of its edges by whoever carried it to him. And he did what he had done with every other unkindness that had come his way in 10 years of living in the dark. He kept working. He did not write to the county. He did not ride down to the Elkhorn to answer for himself. He walked his rows each morning with his bare feet and his hands, and in the 3rd week of August, doing exactly that, he came to a stop in the northeast corner of the shelf where the rock broke through the thin soil in a low gray outcrop, and he stood there a long moment, with his fingers pressed into the dirt, because something under his hand did not match anything else on the quarter section, and it had been a very long time since anything had surprised him. The soil there ran darker than the rest of the bench, and heavier, with a faint mineral bite to it that his fingers remembered from another life entirely, one he had spent at his father's bench in Cinder Gulch weighing rock that other men brought in off the hillsides with their hopes riding on it. Growing up through that dark soil, in a patch no bigger than a wagon bed, was a low weed with a small trumpet-shaped flower that he did not need his eyes to know was the wrong color for anything else on the shelf, because Grace, when he asked her to describe it to him that evening, called it a blue so deep it looked nearly black in the shade, and nearly violet in full sun, and told him it grew nowhere else she had seen on the walk up. Elias sat with that a long while after she left. He knew the plant. His father had called it coppertongue, an old prospector's name passed down from men who had learned, the slow and unscientific way, that where it grew thick, and where nothing else much grew at all, there was often copper close under the surface, and sometimes silver riding along with it, because the two ran together in that country more often than not. Josiah Bramwell had shown him a pressed specimen of it once, kept flat between 2 pieces of glass in his sample case, and had told him that a patch of coppertongue was worth more to a prospector than a week of digging, if a man knew to look for it, and had the patience not to dig too soon. Elias had the patience. He had, if nothing else in this life, an enormous and well-practiced patience. He did not go to Corwin with what he suspected, because he suspected it was worth nothing at all until it was tested, and he had watched, as a boy, more than one hopeful man ruin himself, borrowing against a hunch that an assay later proved worthless. Instead, he began, in the last weeks of August and on into September, walking out to the northeast corner after dark, when the day's garden work was done, and no one from the county road could see what he was doing, even if they had thought to look, and taking soil from 6 different points around the outcrop, each sample wrapped separately in a scrap of cloth and marked, by a system of knots he tied into the cloth itself, so that he would never confuse one for another. He filled a cigar box with them over 3 weeks. He asked Grace, the next time she came up with the mail, whether she would write a letter for him, to a Mr. Aldous Halloway of the Boise Assay and Bullion Office, his father's old partner, and the only man left alive, so far as Elias knew, who might remember Josiah Bramwell's hand well enough to trust what his blind son was about to send him. The box went out on the Tuesday stage with 6 samples, a short letter in Grace's hand explaining what Elias could not write himself, and a request, plain and without embellishment, for whatever truth the rock could tell. Elias did not mention the box to Corwin, or to Drummond, or to anyone in Harrow's Bend beyond Grace and, by necessity, the stage driver who carried it. He went back to his rows the next morning, and hoed them the way he had hoed them every morning since April, because the note at the bank came due on the 1st of October whether or not Boise ever wrote back, and there was corn still standing that would not pick itself. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The 1st of October came in dry and windless, the kind of day the valley got maybe 3 times a season, and Corwin was waiting at his desk when Elias walked into the bank at 10 in the morning, with the crop money he had made from what corn and beans he'd managed to sell at the mercantile, counted twice over by Grace before he came down, so that he would know the sum in his own hand before anyone else touched it. It came to $61 against a note that stood, with interest, at $104. Corwin counted it a 3rd time anyway, aloud, in the particular voice of a man performing patience for an audience of clerks. "That's not the note, Bramwell," he said. "That's little more than half of it. It's what the crop brought," Elias said. "I've a garden still standing and a spring that hasn't gone dry in 10 years. I'm asking for time." Corwin was quiet a moment, and it would have been easy, afterward, for Harrow's Bend to remember only the answer he gave, and not the reasons behind it, which were real enough in their own way. The territorial examiners had been through the bank in July, after 2 bad winters had left half the county's ranchers unable to pay. And Corwin had been told plainly, in a letter he kept locked in his own desk and showed to no one, that the bank's reserves could not carry another season of grace notes without risking its charter. He had a wife and 3 children in the rooms above the bank, and a board of directors in Boise who did not care what his reasons were, only his figures. None of that made its way into what he said next. "The board doesn't extend notes on account of a man's garden," Corwin said. "I'll have the sheriff post the shelf for sale on the courthouse steps 2 weeks from Saturday. You're welcome to bid on your own claims same as anyone, if you can raise the difference by then." He said it evenly, the way he said most things, and did not look up from his ledger while he said it, which was, Grace told Elias later, the thing that had struck her most about the whole exchange, that Corwin had not even had the decency to watch a man's face while he ruined him. Word of the sale went round Harrow's Bend inside a day, the way word of another man's trouble always traveled faster than word of his good fortune, and Silas Drummond made no secret of his intention to be on the courthouse steps that Saturday, with cash in hand. He told the Elkhorn, and the Elkhorn told everyone else, that he meant to have the shelf spring under his own fence by the first snow, and that it was a mercy, when a man thought about it plainly, to put land back into hands that could see to work it. A few men agreed with him out loud. A few more agreed with him by saying nothing at all, which in a town the size of Harrow's Bend amounted to the same thing. The letter from Boise came on the Friday before the sale, carried up to the shelf by young Jim Tanner, Grace's neighbor's boy, who had taken to running errands for Elias that summer in exchange for turnips and, more honestly, in exchange for being allowed to sit and listen while Elias told him things about rock that no one else in Harrow's Bend seemed to know. Jim could not read well enough yet to make sense of the whole thing, but he could read enough of the return address to know it was important looking, and he ran the last quarter mile up the shelf road at a dead sprint. Grace arrived an hour behind him, out of breath herself, having closed the post office in the middle of the afternoon, for the first time in 4 years, to bring the letter up in person rather than wait for her usual rounds. She read it to Elias standing in his own garden, among rows he had planted with his own hands in soil he could not see, and had come, over 18 months, to know better than most sighted men knew anything. Aldous Halloway had run all 6 samples himself, twice, because the first set of figures had seemed to him too good to trust without repeating the work. 4 of the samples showed nothing worth a man's attention. 2 of them, taken from the heart of the outcrop where the coppertongue grew thickest, assayed at values Halloway wrote out in full, because he did not trust an abbreviation to carry the weight of them. 83 ounces of silver to the ton, riding a body of copper ore that his letter estimated, on the strength of the outcrop's width alone, at a size worth a great deal more careful surveying than 6 cigar box samples could tell. Halloway had not waited for Elias to ask what to do next. He had already written, on his own account, to a mining syndicate out of Wallace that he trusted to deal honestly with a small claim, and he expected, his letter said, that a man from that syndicate would be in Harrow's Bend within the week, to see the ground for himself and talk terms, if Elias was willing. Elias stood in his own garden and did not say anything for a long moment, and Grace, watching him, understood that whatever was moving in him just then was not the kind of thing a person interrupted. Then he asked her, in a voice steadier than she expected, whether she thought the syndicate man could reach Harrow's Bend by Saturday. He could not, quite, but a rider from the Wallace office, a young man named Foster Gray, sent ahead of the full party specifically because his employer had read Halloway's letter and did not care to lose the claim to a bank sale in the meantime, rode into Harrow's Bend at a hard trot on Saturday morning, 40 minutes before the courthouse steps sale was set to open, with a letter of his own for the acting sheriff and a bank draft in his coat that he had been authorized to use if matters came to it. The steps were crowded by 10, the way they always were for a sale, men leaning on the rail and on each other, Corwin standing near the front with his ledger under his arm, and Drummond a little apart from him, with cash folded in his breast pocket, and the particular satisfaction on his face of a man who believes the morning is already settled in his favor. Elias stood at the back with Grace's hand light on his elbow, not for guidance so much as for her own steadiness, because she had read the letter twice more on the ride down and could not stop turning the figures over. The sheriff read the notice aloud, the legal language of it, the description of the quarter section by its survey markers, the amount owing, the terms of sale. He asked for the opening bid. Drummond opened it before the sheriff had finished asking. $110, he said, loud enough to carry to the back of the crowd, more than the note required, a figure meant to close the matter in one breath and leave no room for anyone poorer than himself to try. A few men murmured. Corwin nodded, satisfied, already reaching for his pen to note the sale, when Foster Gray stepped up onto the bottom step, still dusty from the road, and said that before the sheriff took that bid, the Wallace Mining and Reduction Company would like the opportunity to speak to the value of the claim under sale. The crowd on the steps had been loud a minute before and went quiet the way a crowd goes quiet when it senses, before it understands, that something has shifted under its feet. Gray did not make a speech. He was not built for one, and he did not try. He read Holloway's figures aloud from a second copy he had carried with him for exactly this purpose. The 83 ounces to the ton, the copper body beneath it, the copper tongue growing thick over the outcrop that any man in that county could ride up and see with his own eyes if he doubted the assay office's word for it. And he said, plainly, that his company considered the claim worth a great deal more than $110, and that it stood ready to purchase the note outright, in full, that morning, to protect its interest in dealing fairly and directly with the man who held the patent. Corwin's pen stopped moving. He looked at Elias for what Grace said afterward was the first time she had ever seen him actually look at a person rather than at the figures a person represented. Drummond said nothing at all for a long moment, and then he said, to no one in particular, that the outcrop had been sitting there the whole 3 years he'd wanted the shelf for its water, and that he'd ridden past it 100 times and never once gotten down off his horse to look at what was growing on it. It was not quite an apology. It was closer to one than anything Harrow's Bend had heard from Silas Drummond in a long while, and a few of the men nearest him, who had laughed with him on the Elkhorn steps back in August, did not laugh now. Old Amos Fry, who had run cattle in that county for 40 years and had known Josiah Bramwell before he ever knew Josiah's son, pushed his way to the front and said, loud enough for the whole steps to hear, that he remembered the copper tongue growing on the Bittner claim 2 counties over back in '68. And that everybody had called Old Man Bittner touched in the head for digging where he did, right up until the day he wasn't. A ripple of something that was not quite laughter, but stood near it, moved through the crowd. The sheriff, who had been holding the gavel loosely in one hand through the whole exchange, looked at Corwin and asked, in the flat voice of a man who wants the morning's business concluded correctly, whether the bank intended to accept the syndicate's offer to purchase the note in full. Corwin accepted it. He had little choice, with a company draft on the table for the full $104 and every man on the steps now watching to see whether he would take the fair price or hold out from spite, and to his credit, whatever else could be said of him that morning, he did not hold out. He signed the note over, said it was a pleasure doing business, and did not entirely meet Elias's eyes when he said it, which Elias could not see but heard clearly enough in the shape of the sentence. Elias did not gloat over the steps that morning, and it would not have suited him if he had tried. He asked only one thing of Corwin before the crowd broke up, quietly enough that few people beyond Grace and the sheriff heard it at all, which was that the bank extend the same 6 months' grace to any other small claim in the county that came to it in genuine hardship before it foreclosed, rather than after, the way it had very nearly done to him. Corwin said he would take it up with the board. He did, in fact, take it up with the board that winter, and the policy that came of it, unglamorous as it was, outlived Corwin's own tenure at the bank by a decade. Drummond rode up to the shelf himself 2 weeks later, alone, without his hands along to see him do it, and asked whether Elias would sell him water rights to the spring at a fair price now that the syndicate's survey crews would need the water too. Elias said he would, at whatever rate a neutral man in Boise set for it, and Drummond agreed without argument, and stood a while afterward, at the fence line the way Grace had stood there in September, not saying much, before he rode home. He never told anyone in Harrow's Bend, though he told Elias once, years later, over a fence rail with nothing stronger than coffee between them, that his own father had lost a homestead 2 states back to a banknote when Drummond was 9 years old, and that he had spent every year since making certain it never happened to him again, at whatever cost to whoever stood between him and the certainty of it. Homer Riggs came up to the shelf himself that November, the first time he had ever climbed the road he had described, 18 months before, as fit for nothing but scrub and rattlesnake weed. He did not apologize outright. Land agents rarely do, and Elias did not expect it of him. He stood at the fence a while, the way most of them did before they said anything worth hearing, and then he asked whether Elias would consider filing an amended plat with the county, since the office's old survey markers for the shelf were, he admitted, 30 years out of date, and had never once accounted for what lay under the ground they described. Elias said he would be glad to. The mercantile stopped adding the customary 2% it had quietly charged him on seed and tools since his first spring in the valley, a practice corrected that winter the way a great many small unfairnesses in Harrow's Bend were corrected, without anyone troubling to name it out loud. The syndicate men surveyed the shelf through that winter and into the spring, and by the following summer, there was a proper shaft house on the outcrop and a crew of 11 working it, paying Elias a royalty on every ton that came out that would, within 3 years, make him a wealthier man than anyone in Harrow's Bend who had laughed at him on the Elkhorn steps the August before. He did not move off the shelf when the money came. He built onto the cabin, a proper second room with glass windows he would never see through and did not need to, and he kept the rope lines strung between the porch and the well and the garden rows exactly as they had always been, because a man does not throw away the sentences he wrote to himself in the dark simply because the world around him has changed its opinion of his handwriting. He married Grace Linden the following October, a year to the week after the sale on the courthouse steps, in a small ceremony at the post office, because she said she saw no reason to close it for a whole day on her own account. Jim Tanner stood up as near a witness as a 10-year-old boy could formally be, and Amos Fry came, and Corwin sent a modest gift and a note that was, for him, unusually warm. Drummond did not come, but he sent word by a hired hand that he hoped they would be happy, which from a man of his particular pride was its own kind of blessing. On the good evenings that first spring, Elias would walk the coppertongue patch with Grace beside him, not to check on the mine, which the syndicate men managed well enough without him, but because the flower still grew there in a border the crew had left untouched at his own request. A low blue weed worth nothing at all by itself, and everything, once, to a man who had learned as a boy to read a hillside with his hands, and had never once stopped trusting what they told him, even in the years when the whole of Harrow's Bend had been certain there was nothing on that shelf worth a blind man's trouble. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.